but I mean, it's quite possible, likely perhaps, that Sanskrit itself, Vedic Sanskrit, if you will, originated in India and South Asia. But the question is the language ancestral to Sanskrit, the deepest mother tongue. There's really no good evidence that that originated in India. Some people claim that it did, but I think they do so on nationalistic or cultural grounds. It really doesn't have the evidence.
Yeah, I wanted to add something when you mentioned that the proposal that we criticize it sort of was based on the techniques that were used to determine how viruses spread. It occurred to me that this book came out, pre-pandemic, and in the pandemic we all learned that viruses don't spread the way viruses spread, right? I mean, they don't just geographically spread uniformly, but there were these super spreader events. And I think when we think about historical linguistics, it's very possible that there were these kind of super spreaders.
One thing that I would say is this is not a settled issue. New evidence continues to come up. As new evidence comes up, I think we have to be open-minded, and we have to assess that evidence, and we have to be willing to change our mind. Now, sometimes new evidence can really change the way we look at things.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today, we have noted historians Dr. Asya Pereltsvaig and Dr. Martin Lewis on our show. Today, we'll discuss Asya and Martin's book, The Indo-European Controversy, Facts and Fallacies in Historical Linguistics. Welcome, Asya and Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Phylogenetic and phylogeographical analysis that treats linguistics cognates like genes and explain spread of languages in terms of diffusion of viruses. Using these techniques, researchers claim to have located the origin of Indo-European languages family in Neolithic Anatolia, challenging other hypotheses. But despite its widespread celebration in global media, this new approach fails to withstand scrutiny, as languages do not evolve like biological species and do not spread like viruses. The model produces incoherent results contradicted by empirical record by every turn. Dr. Pereltsvaig and Dr. Lewis assert that origin and spread of languages must examined primarily through the time-tested techniques of linguistic analysis rather than those of evolutionary biology. Asya Pereltsvaig received her PhD in linguistics from McGill University and has taught at Yale, Cornell, and Stanford, as well as in several US and European universities. Dr. Martin Lewis is a senior lecturer in international history at Stanford University. Professor, so my first question would be knowing about the motivation of this book and why is the study of origin of Indo-European languages so important?
Okay, well, I will take that one on first. Well, Indo-European languages are spoken by roughly half of the people in the world and cover probably a little bit more than half of the world geographically. So from central India all the way through Iran, through almost all of Europe, Russia, and then by extension in the Americas, North America, South America, and Australia. So it's the largest language family by a wide margin. The other issue is there have been many theories associated with the spread of Indo-European languages that have been very problematic, to say the least. For example, it was used by Nazi theorists to try to establish the so-called superiority of the Aryan people, by which they meant Germanic people. It's been used by a variety of different schools of thought to put forward views of human history that are really not supportable. So it has generated a huge amount of controversy over the years. Plus, it's just a very important issue in historical linguistics. How do we determine how a language family emerges and how that family spreads? How do we figure out the relationships between different languages? And you could do this with any language family, but there's been more work done on the Indo-European family than on any other one. So it occupies a central role.
So why do we need a study of languages? Can we construct history by simply studying linguistics?
I think I should be the one to answer this question. I think linguistics is a very important tool because it allows us to go much further in temporal depth than other methods that historians typically use. Historians typically work with written documents, but that only takes us that far because writing appeared only relatively recently, in some places maybe 5,000-6,000 years ago, but in many places around the world even much less than that. So if we want to establish the history of humankind beyond that time frame, linguistics is one tool that allows us to do that.
Yeah, so moving ahead, so what are the major theories that explain Indo-European languages origin?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase the question, please?
So I'm asking about there are several theories that explain the origin of Indo-European languages, like Kurgan theory. You have this Steppe hypothesis, and then you have Anatolian, and then free view. So I just wanted to know for my viewers, what are those major theories that explains us?
Okay, I'll take this question. There have been a number of different theories. The two main ones, and the ones that we deal with extensively, would be the steppe theory, or sometimes called Kurgan theory, on the one hand, and the Anatolian theory on the other. There's also Armenian hypothesis and a number of others. The mainstream theory found among historical linguists and archaeologists, and has for some time, is that Indo-European languages originated in the grassland belt of Eurasia, the western part of the grassland belt, essentially what is now the so-called steppe zone of Ukraine, parts of southern Russia, into Kazakhstan, and was associated with people who domesticated the horse. Domesticating the horse gave them a tremendous amount of advantages in mobility, eventually advantages in military, allowed them to spread their language and spread their genes, as we now know as well. As I said before, this theory has been associated with some very troublesome views. The view that the original speakers were the superior specimens of humanity that the Nazis used, or even there was a feminist view that it's still around, that these were sort of the original bad guys of history. These were the bloody patriarchal warriors who destroyed peaceful, egalitarian, female-centered cultures. So it has both negative and positive views. The other main theory has been that it originated with agriculturalists, early Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, what is now Turkey, who simply spread gradually into areas that didn't have farming before. And so there was this very slow, gradual rate of advance. So the first theory has tended to emphasize rapid movement. We don't know how rapid, and a lot of conflict and bloodshed. The second one has stressed very slow movement and more peaceful processes. The Anatolian theory was the one supported by the article based on biological techniques that we criticized. It was actually originated by an archaeologist, Colin Renfrew, and I suspect partly it was in order to undermine this view that this was a bloody, violent process. A lot of people preferred a much more peaceful one. Asya might want to talk about the Armenian hypothesis and some of the others, which she dealt with quite extensively as far as the linguistic analysis goes. But there are a number of these theories. These are just the two main ones.
Yeah, these are the main theories, not only in terms of just the scholarship that we either criticize or support, but also in geographical terms. So, for example, the Armenian hypothesis that Martin has just mentioned, it's not in present day Armenia, but rather further south, where so Greater Armenia used to be historically. So it really sort of very much in the same geographical range as the Anatolian theory. In linguistic scholarship, well, mostly in the 19th and early 20th century, there were people who placed the origin of Indo-European languages sort of roughly in the Baltic area, maybe like Poland and thereabouts. But that's somewhat similar to the steppe theory or the kind of overlapping geographical areas. So the other hypotheses, they might be a little more precise in sort of where geographically they put the origin of Indo-European languages. But I think the two big theories that Martin outlined, they're really sort of the two core approaches.
I would want to mention, if it's okay if I step in, that there has been and is still a theory put forward by scholars from India who claim that the Indo-European languages originated in the Indian subcontinent, perhaps with the Indus Valley civilization, and then spread outward from there. Although there are a lot of people who firmly follow this hypothesis, most scholars, and certainly I think almost all scholars outside of India, don't see very much, or if any, evidence for it.
Yeah. I wanted to add something when you mentioned that the proposal that we criticize, it sort of was based on the techniques that were used to determine how viruses spread. It occurred to me that this book came out, pre-pandemic, and in the pandemic we all learned that viruses don't spread the way viruses spread, right? I mean, they don't just geographically spread uniformly, but there were these super spreader events. And I think when we think about historical linguistics, it's very possible that there were these kind of super spreaders when just a small group migrated somewhere, brought the language with them, imposed it on the larger local population, kind of going outside of the Indo-European language family. That's pretty much what happened to Hungarian. The origin of the Hungarian language is somewhere east of the Ural Mountains, and a fairly small group of people came to where Hungary is today in Central Europe and imposed their language. You can think of it as a sort of a super spreader event where there's just a small group that's responsible on taking something in an unusual, unexpected direction.
Very interesting. I had never thought of that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, so adding to that, like I'll give you the recent example what happened to India post independence. So India divided into India and Pakistan. So both countries decided to go with two different ethnicity. So the language was Hindustani, that has Arabian, Persian, and then Sanskrit mix. So the Pakistani part decided they will take forward the Arabian and Persian mix and call it Urdu, and Indian counterpart decided they will call it Hindi, and they will propagate Sanskrit as the major source. So now if you go in India and Pakistan, you will find both countries completely unrelated in terms of languages. They have same diction, but when it comes to usage of word, it's totally different. So after 100 years down the line, people won't be recognizing that these two countries originated from the same origin. So this is a super spreader event that I would like to say. It was a kind of super spreader event. Two political ideology force the different kind of languages in same set of people.
Well, I'm just going to say, you're talking about the politicization of languages, and that is an important issue as well. The book that we criticize, it's based on this very large computer analysis going back many thousands of years, but the input data, the languages they input into their model, are often based on modern politicized languages that follow national borders. So they have this input map where they're using these these current borders. Well, here's an example from India. For the original location of Sanskrit, they used the geographical boundaries of Punjab under the British Raj. So that would have been both the Indian state of Punjab, Haryana, the Pakistani province of Punjab, and Himachal Pradesh. And that's how they map it. But it's totally a modern issue. It has nothing to do with where Vedic Sanskrit was spoken. It certainly wasn't spoken up in the high mountains of the Himalayas. So politics often gets in the way of linguistic analysis.
So moving ahead, so we'll move to the major thesis of this book. Why did Gray-Atkinson chose only Anatolian and Steppe theory for their research? Is there any special consideration? They only chose two for this very analysis. Like if you have 5-6 present hypotheses, so you should choose all those, and then based on your research you should select one. So why did they decided to choose only two hypotheses?
Well, I'll take a first stab, and Asya, maybe you want to afterwards. They claim they didn't do that. They claim that it's a neutral analysis, and it could have turned out any sort of origin point. The computer does the work. The input goes in. There are certain assumptions made, but a lot of the assumptions they made biased it in favor of that origin. For example, they assumed that language spreads did this very slow process called demic diffusion, just this gradual movement of people who are otherwise sedentary. They rule out migration ahead of time. Plus, there are a lot of historical languages that are very poorly attested. We have just a few words, perhaps. So we're pretty sure that the languages spoken by the ancient Scythians who lived in that steppe zone was an Indo-European language or Indo-European languages. We have some personal names, we have some place names, but we don't have enough information on that to put it into this computer model. So you have large parts of the world that are just left out, and that biases the model away from this grassland zone because we just don't have the evidence about these languages. But we do have enough evidence to know that at least many of them were Indo-European. Asya, I don't know if you fully agree with that, but
continue with that point. I agree that it comes out as the Anatolian analysis, the Anatolian theory is correct because some of the fallacies that they make with the analysis itself sort of bias it both geographically but also in terms of time. I think what we haven't mentioned so far is that the two major theories not only differ in the location of the homeland, in the European homeland, but also in the time when that ancestral Indo-European language, Proto-Indo-European, was spoken. They differ by about 3,000 years, with Anatolian being earlier and the steppe hypothesis saying no, it was about 3,000 years later. This work that we criticize in the book, they make several mistakes that we discuss in the book that all work sort of conjointly in the same direction. They all make that ancestral language appear older than it actually is if you fix those mistakes. So that also biases in the direction of the Anatolian hypothesis.
Asya, since we're talking about India, do you want to mention the Romani example, which is interesting and so powerful?
That is a great example. Thanks for reminding me, Martin. So Romani, the language of the Roma people, of the Gypsies, we know now that they came out of India and migrated gradually to Europe. But actually, they were one of the very first groups on which the historical linguistics sort of honed its tools back in the 1700s. But we know from historical linguistic scholarship is that the Roma left India about roughly 1,000 years ago, give or take. But in the analysis that we criticize, it's actually 3,500 years ago. So there's a huge gap of 2.5 millennia. They supposedly left much earlier, according to those people we criticize. And the problem is that because while the Roma were gradually migrating and living side by side with different other groups, speaking various languages, Greek, Persian, Armenian, they picked up a lot of words from these other languages. And the way that this analysis, Gray-Atkinson analysis, works is if a language borrowed a lot of its vocabulary, especially basic vocabulary, then it makes that language appear more distinctive and also, therefore, older, like it's split much earlier than it actually did. It just biases in that direction of being older than it is. And in the case of Romani, yeah, the gap is huge. So then it pushes everything else further back in time. If the Romani left India that early, then various other splits in the Indo-European tree, they all pushed further back in time. And that, again, gives us a much earlier date for the entire Proto-Indo-European, sort of the ancestral language.
And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, we know that Romani had to have been in India roughly 1,000 years ago because it shares many innovations that were found in Hindustani and other related languages. So they did a number of grammatical shifts, shifts in gender, and Romani did exactly the same ones. So they wouldn't have had these same shifts if they had left 1,000 years earlier. There's no way they could have had that telecommunication. So you can kind of pinpoint it at a time. Well, not pinpoint it, but get it pretty close.
We can get it pretty close, and there's many different phenomena. There's the restructuring of the gender system. There's some sound changes that happen, and the chances of them happening exactly the same way to languages that are now spoken by people who live that far away is just like virtually nil. It's unless they had telecommunications, they clearly didn't that far back. And what's interesting is that now genetic research comes along. We said how linguistics is a tool for historians to use. Genetics is another tool. Well, geneticists studied the Roma people as well, their DNA, and showed that they must have left India also about 1,000 years ago. Okay, so we actually kind of agree there, which is good, which is what you want to see, people working in different fields coming together with a similar story.
And I would add just briefly, genetic analysis that came out just after we published the book, and is still coming out, shows that there was a substantial transfer of genes from that same steppe zone into Europe, into Iran, into northern India, and that matches the steppe hypothesis or Kurgan hypothesis. It does not match the Anatolian hypothesis. So I really think that's almost put an end to that hypothesis.
There are many theories in your book that you give to counter the Gray-Atkinson phylogenetic model. That includes the linguistic failure, dating failure, and geographical contradiction. So, according to you, so many theories that you have given. So, which one is the major theory that contradicts this phylogenetic model?
So, you want to take that on, or should I?
I can try and answer that question. So, we do talk about different, and that's why it's interesting that I'm a linguist, Martin is a geographer, and we can kind of bring our expertise from different fields. And what we found is that there were so many problems with both the linguistic side of things and the geographical. So I don't think there is, one particular argument that just like seals the deal and is more important than the others. But they have problems kind of at every turn. And we'll also sort of catalog some of the errors, and some of them are kind of funny. Like, for example, in their sort of animated map where they show how Indo-European languages spread, they pretty much have the Vikings kind of sailing to Iceland for 200 years, kind of and until they actually finally get there. So they have all kinds of rather ridiculous things, but I think it's because there's a lot of mistaken assumptions that go into the way that their analysis works. I mean, yeah, it's wonderful to have a computer who does all the calculations for you, but the computer produced result is only as good as the data you feed into it. And I think that one of the big conclusions that we came to in this book is that it's good when people try different approaches, but you can't just like get into a field that you don't understand and decide that you're gonna be doing it completely differently and completely sort of throw out all of the scholarship that happened. And I think that's pretty much what we dealt with in terms of Gray-Atkinson work. They just disregarded a lot of the findings of the historical linguistic scholarship and also, historical and geographical scholarship as well.
Yes, I would say that from a linguistics perspective, probably the biggest problem is they reduce almost everything to vocabulary. It's just the words. And there are a lot of assumptions that are problematic. The idea that every meaning is associated with one word, that you can supposedly very easily determine what words are borrowed and what words aren't. But as Asya in her chapter shows so well, sound changes, grammatical changes, many of these are much more basic. Words can flow from language to language very easily. Uh, most modern languages is filled with loan words, but to change something like a sound, as an adult, it's almost impossible. I mean, I don't think I would ever be able to learn South Asian retroflex consonants. It just would be beyond my capacity. Or ejectives, or there's so many. I mean, I can't even hear them. I can listen, and that they make no sense. And so this is so much more fundamental. And then Asha mentioned this animated map. So it's featured very prominently on their website. And it's a map with very little explanation. It just says, watch the unfolding of the Indo-European languages over time. And it's visually quite impressive. It's really quite a beautiful thing. But I took a lot of time, and Asha spent some time on it too, analyzing it frame by frame practically. And there was nothing I could find in it that was correct. It wasn't that it had mistakes, it had no non mistakes, if you will. That it showed languages that we know. This is for the historically demonstrated time, the last couple thousand years. And we know a lot about how languages spread and where they were at different times. But this is just again and again just showing these bizarre features of Romance languages diverging out of Italy and spreading like viruses across Europe. Or Ashley just mentioned this maritime creep of 300 years, Vikings on ships drifting towards Iceland. It just didn't make any sense. So yeah, it's beautiful, it's impressive, but it's just wrong at every single turn. So if something is wrong in all of its specifics, how can it be right in its general assumptions? Gray and Atkinson, we've communicated with them, or we did at the time, and they said, well, science has to have simplifying assumptions, and over time we'll hone it and we'll get it better. But I don't think it can happen when everything is wrong.
Yeah, if I can add to that, yeah, we understand that sometimes you simplify things somewhat and for presentation purposes as well, but it has to have some value compared to the scholarship that is already there. In a way, if we go back to this biological metaphor or medical virus metaphor, when medications or vaccines are approved, they have to be better than the existing ones. You can't approve a medication that has lower efficacy than the existing medication. Like FDA, for example, here in the States, would not approve a medication like that. I think the same principle could very well be applied in science. If you propose a new methodology, it has to be an improvement of what exists already and not throwing away old scholarship or proposing something that can not even get like 10% of what the old scholarship allowed you to do. I think that's kind of, looking in retrospect now, some years after the book was published, I think that is still very much true today. I mean, they haven't honed it.
And let me just add one thing too. As a non-linguist, I'm in awe of what historical linguists have been able to do. Tracing out these systematic sound changes, linking languages. I mean, they can even do a pretty good reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, spoken many thousands of years ago, never written, extinct for millennia, and they can, maybe not perfectly, but do a pretty good job. And this just entails painstaking work, just incredibly difficult work that scholars have been doing now for generations. And the Gray-Atkinson model would say, oh, that's really trivial. It doesn't work. Let's just use a biological model and we can have this huge shortcut. Forget about all this has been done. And I find that deeply offensive, to be quite be quite honest. This is a precious legacy of scholarship that so many people have worked so hard on. And it's really impressive what they've done. And we have to cherish that legacy of scholarship.
Talking about the linguistic point of view, so suppose I want to find the common origins between two languages. So what would be my criteria? Should I go after the verb or should I go after the noun?
Let me try to sort of outline the basic answer here. What you're going to look for is points of similarity between two languages. And you want them to be, quite numerous. You don't want to just find a couple of words that are accidentally look-alikes and, it's just by accident. There's only so many different sounds human languages can make. Something is going to be similar. And you want to look for similarities that are not just in the way that certain objects are named, or certain actions are named. So it's not about nouns or verbs. You want to look for points of similarity in sound patterns and in grammatical patterns. So if you find languages that have similar systems of case, for example, or similar systems of verbal declension, so not specific verbs, but the way that the language is organized. That's very important, and that's very much disregarded in the Gray-Atkinson framework. They pretty much focus on vocabulary, as Martin said earlier.
One thing I would add is that if you have language that are historically written, attested, you want to go back to the earliest texts that you can find. And this is very interesting because this kind of work has revealed that some groups of languages that we thought were language families turn out not to be language families. They were not descended from one common ancestor. So a good example of the so-called Altaic languages, this would be Mongolian, all of the Turkish languages, they have a lot of similarities. They have a lot of vocabulary similarities. They have sound similarities, grammatical similarities. But if you go back to the oldest Mongolian text and the oldest Turkish text that we can find, they look more different rather than more similar. Whereas if you go to, say, Sanskrit and Latin, they're a lot closer than Hindi and Italian because they came from a common ancestor. What happened with the Altaic languages was on the grassland belt, there was so much merging and mixing of people. If you look at the armies of Genghis Khan, for example, there were people speaking all kinds of languages. And they had to have a common means of communication. So they end up sharing so much, it looks like they're related, but historical linguistic analysis shows, no, they just shared a lot. They didn't descend from the common ancestor. So I think that's an important thing too.
So coming back to this out of India theory, and in India people believe that. So there are some Indologists and linguists such as Srikant Talagiri, Nicholas Kajans, who studied Rig Veda and have given proof out of that textbook that Sanskrit originated from India. So I just want to have your thought on that.
Asya, you want to give that a try first?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not the origin of Sanskrit that we're talking about. We're talking about the origins of Proto-Indo-European, which predated Sanskrit by several millennia. So in the rear view, it seems like millennium here or there, like it's the same time. But if you think about things that happened 1,000 years ago, we're not at all close to these guys 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. Oh, that was a really long time ago. So this would be a very big margin of a difference. In terms of linguistic evidence, there's different ways in which we can try and locate the homeland of a particular, ancestral language geographically. One is to look for words that we can reconstruct for that ancestral language and see where a particular sort of natural environment or some cultural elements were present. So, for example, if we reconstruct a word for snow, which we do for Proto-Indo-European, it means that they either lived far enough north or far high enough in the mountains to be familiar with snow. There is another argument that concerns rather non-reconstruction of the word for sea. So if you take the word for sea or different bodies of water, in fact, in different Indo-European languages, they're all very different. They don't match up. That means that we cannot reconstruct a word for sea for Proto-Indo-European, which probably means they did not live by a sea of some sort. So we can use this kind of technique to try and at least sort of narrow down the possibilities of where speakers of Proto-Indo-European live. There's another approach which we also discuss in our book, and that is to look at evidence of contact with other ancient languages of the same time. And in the case of Proto-Indo-European, we find some evidence of contact with Proto-Kartvelian, the ancestral language of present-day Georgian, which is in the Caucasus. Also, evidence of contact with Proto-Uralic, the ancestor of languages as far apart as Hungarian, Finnish, and Samoyedic languages in Siberia, in Russian far north. But if we try to sort of triangulate where all of these ancient languages were spoken, that rather places Proto-Indo-European between the Caucasus and the Ural Mountains, and that southern Russia, Ukraine, steppe zone is in the right place. India is a bit too far, for those contacts to have been occurring in that path.
Right. Yeah. So just to reiterate a little bit, I mean, it's quite possible, likely perhaps, that Sanskrit itself, Vedic Sanskrit, if you will, originated in India and South Asia. But the question is the language ancestral to Sanskrit, the deepest mother tongue. There's really no good evidence that originated in India. Some people claim that it did, but I think they do so on nationalistic or cultural grounds. It really doesn't have the evidence. As far as the ancient Indus Valley civilization, the problem is their script has not been deciphered, and it probably never will. I mean, maybe, who knows? But I don't think there's even really any progress in deciphering that script. And until and unless that is deciphered, there's really no way of saying. A good chance that it was, I suppose, a Dravidian language. There is genetic evidence now that some of the first farmers coming into India came from what is now probably Iran, much before the Indo-European languages spread. We know from genetic analysis that there was a big movement of what's called ancestral South Asians. They probably brought agriculture to the region, although there was another group from Southeast Asia. The Munda people, for example, speak a language in the Austroasiatic family, and they probably brought farming. We know from genetic analysis that Bengalis especially have about 20% of their genome comes from Southeast Asia. So there was movement from that direction as well. But that's true of the whole world. I mean, that's what this genetic analysis is showing, is that people have moved a lot. There have been all sorts of pretty long distance migration streams. But see, here's a problem: is archaeologists used to think everything was about migration. And then there was a reaction against that. And archaeologists decided, well, nothing comes from migration. And so the Anatolian hypothesis was based on the idea that there's virtually no migration. People are stay-at-homes and they move a couple kilometers in a year, maybe. Well, the genetic analysis just disproves that. A lot of people moved very far and they spread their genes. Sometimes when they spread their genes, they spread their language. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes, like Asya mentioned, the Hungarians. The original Hungarians who brought their language, they didn't really even spread their genes. We can hardly see a genetic signature at all to get their language spread. That's something I find fascinating and kind of mysterious, why sometimes people come in and their language spreads and sometimes it doesn't. I think there might be a lot of chance elements involved, but I haven't followed the research as well, I'm sure, as Asya does. Maybe you have some perspectives on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight another point that we sort of alluded to a few times, but maybe didn't make so clear. The Gray-Atkinson framework relies very heavily on this idea that when you look at the map, languages and people spread uniformly in all directions, meaning one day they go like kilometer north, and next year they go kilometer west, and then it can go south. Just kind of random. But it isn't really random because they're not spreading over, a petri dish which has a uniform cell culture, right? It's very diverse, as Martin, as a geographer, can talk more about that. But there are rivers, there are mountains, there are seas, there are different kinds of seas, there are different kinds of rivers, and all of these things impact where people would or wouldn't go. And rivers historically provided like highways for migration, trade, communication, cultural spread, linguistic spread, genetic spread, and just to disregard it and say, well, there's the computation will take care of itself over millennia. I think that's pretty ridiculous.
Right, and I just add, it also depends on technology. The Sahara was not crossable until people domesticated camels. Then they could cross it. Or water bodies might be a total barrier until you develop adequate seacraft, and then it become a highway. And so over time, this changes as well. And that just adds to the importance of both the historical dimension and the physical geographical background. The Gray-Atkinson model treats land as a flat, uniform plane with no features. And that's just not really supportable.
They're not on the same planet as we are. Yeah.
In your book, you discuss a lot of theories how language evolve over a time. Suppose like a Proto-Indo-European language, or prior to that language. So most of the languages of Europe and Indian subcontinent and even Asia originated from same languages, but over the period of time, all became totally different alike. So what are the factors behind that? Is it the geographical features, uh, altitude, longitude, temperature, cold climate, hot climate, and then you have a food habits. So all this is that play a major role to over period of time a language become totally distinguishable from its mother tongue.
Asha, you want to take that on first?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of these things, and there's some role that physical geography plays. So it's quite well known now that languages that find themselves in the mountains, they start to sort of disperse and become more distinctive because communication and travel is harder in mountainous zones. And as opposed to, for example, open grasslands or plains where it's much easier, especially after you domesticate the horse, you get on a horse and there you are very quickly somewhere else. So that plays an important role. But really, languages change all the time. If you listen to how your parents speak very, very carefully, or how your children speak, you'll see that, even just one generation apart, things are not exactly the same. It might require you to really pay attention, but over a course of even a few generations, language changes quite considerably. Now we're lucky because we can actually listen to recordings. I've been doing some historical work and listening to recordings of people who grew up in the late 19th century and were already old when they were recorded on tape or something. But people who picked up their language more than 100 years ago, it's not as far back as 5-6 millennia that we mentioned in connection with Proto-Indo-European, but you already notice considerable differences in terms of how people speak, word choice, grammar, pronunciation, intonation, all of it. Like if you listen to people like I don't know, Winston Churchill, for example, recordings of his, or I'm sure people from India also, now you can probably find recordings even going back a couple of generations, and you'll see that it's not quite how people talk anymore. Or listen to teenagers, and you'll see they don't talk like we older people.
And it probably, in most cases, language changed more rapidly when you had small scale societies, before you had institutionalized education systems, before you had mass media. So even today it's changing. But there are some studies, I think, especially from Australian Aboriginal languages, where they had recordings made in the early 20th century, and then linguists have gone back and re-recorded it and found profound changes in those languages. So it's just an intrinsic characteristic of humankind that our languages diverge. So you can have a language that spreads rapidly, and there's a kind of uniformity at first, but it's already changing into different dialects, and those dialects give them time, and they'll become completely separate languages, and they'll lose the ability to be intelligible. But now people also need to have means of communication, so you get phenomena like lingua francas, or common like trade languages. And another thing, is the profound multilingualism of a lot of people. The Gray-Atkinson model really can't handle multilingualism. It's like every group is a single group of people and they all speak the same language. But it's really a lot more complicated than that. People in the United States tend to forget it because most Americans don't have more than one language. But if you're in Bangalore, right? I mean, you've got how many languages are being spoken there? You've got Kannada and Tamil and Hindi, and there's a lot of Gujarati speakers there, and of course everyone speaks English, and just profoundly multilingual.
More than 6 to 7 languages. Even I know 4 languages.
Yeah, and a lot of times, people, you'll have multilingual household, and then maybe parents will decide, well, we'll raise our children in one language or another language, and so that you can get change in that way.
So talking about historical dating, talking about warmer climate like India, where finding archaeological proof of, say, 8,000 BC or 10,000 BC is very difficult. So in that case, can we rely on the linguistic dating?
I think so. Yeah, I think that there are some sort of peculiarities that have to do with a particular location. Another important thing that happens with a lot of migrations, let's not forget that our planet, sort of our physical geography of the planet changes too. So many important sites of evidence for migratory patterns, millennia ago, are now underwater, and there's a field of aquatic archaeology that's developing. Like, how do you dig under the ocean or under the sea, or even just in areas that have been sort of transformed geographically in a significant way.
Right, and also a sedimentation too. So 8,000 years ago, well, let's just take the Indus Delta in Pakistan. That would have been much further inland. A lot of that is filled up with sediment. So there may have been very important sites that have been not just covered by the sea, but covered by deep layers of sediments and all sorts of other changes in the physical environment. But I'm not sure, Dad, if we really got your question. Were you talking about dating of languages?
So my question was that in that case, if you don't have any archaeological proof, so can you rely on the dating done by linguists? So linguists also do the dating based on the formation of words, and the archaic words, they do the dating You have mentioned the dating
Right.
process.
Can linguists do dates? Yes.
Linguists, yes. Well, linguists can certainly do relative chronologies. So we can determine that certain things happened in a particular language or a group of language earlier or later than something else. So we're quite good at like ordering the different developments. And then if you can, at least to some extent, locate one or the other of these changes in time, then you at least know that something must have happened earlier then. Like when we were talking about the Romani example, we said that some grammatical changes happened about 1,000 years ago based on written text that we have from Sanskrit, for example. So we know that those changes in Romani must have also happened no earlier than. We can't say exactly that they happened on Thursday at like 9 a.m. On this particular date of that particular year, but we can give kind of approximations. And I think where Gray-Atkinson also kind of is that what they decided to do is use the so-called calibration points. So they say, okay, we're going to use certain things that we know from history or we think we know from history, and they make a lot of mistakes. And we're going to pinpoint some of those splits on the tree and kind of tie those down in time, and then everything else is kind of in relation to that. But if you do that, you have to be extremely careful about deciding when those events are. And most, if not all, of their calibration points are based on historical events, which may or may not be when certain linguistic changes happened. What they should have worked with is known linguistic texts, for example, rather than a historical event. So not, for example, the breakup of the Roman Empire, but a particular text that attests to a particular development in, say, what will become French or Italian and so on. So one has to be careful about, doing linguistics using linguistic data and linguistic instruments and not mixing wrong historical tools in.
One other thing I'd like to add is there does seem to be a time limit, not a firm time limit, but a general time limit on how far back you can trace language families. And again, Asya would know much more about this than I do. But if you go back, say, 10,000 years, it just seems that there's so many changes that are so profound that you're really not going to have much of any trace of a relationship. There are some linguists who claim to have evidence for these superfamilies, where you can take Indo-European and maybe Uralic languages, and I don't know, they're putting Dravidian. What's the Nostratic hypothesis? I mean, there's all kinds of families, but they can't really prove it. So these are interesting theories. But linguistics is a very precise, logical discipline that really emphasizes proof. They really can, prove a lot of things. And so these kind of speculative theories are interesting, but they're not solid. You just can only go back so far in the past. And it's very unlike organic evolution, right? Where the further back you go in a way, the clearer are the relationship of, but language doesn't work that way. It just changes too much.
Right. So in your book, you have mentioned there are so many traditional techniques of historical linguists. In that, you have mentioned a quote that says that comparative method is a gold standard. So tell us something about comparative methods, why it is so much used.
Yeah, comparative method is basically the essence of that scholarship that Martin said that we should cherish the language of. I really appreciated in that. But it's really a method that kind of was worked out of attempts to reconstruct and try different groupings of languages, and was tested against known answers, right? So people used, for example, those methods to reconstruct, say, Latin based on Romance languages, or reconstruct Sanskrit or the spoken language. Sanskrit is a bit, it's a literary language, a religious language, but it's not necessarily how people spoke at home. But to reconstruct the language that was spoken at the same time as Sanskrit and then compare it to Sanskrit, but we have something to compare it to. We can say, oh, we got this right, or we got this wrong. By now, because of this verification that happened many, many times, we now have this method that already sort of was honed, whereas what Gray and Atkinson proposed in their framework is a new method, and they can't get those same results that we now sort of have as the known answers. So they fail that verification, and that's what kind of the upshot of our book. I don't know if Martin wants to add something.
No, I'm on pretty shaky ground when it comes to that kind of linguistic analysis. So I'll let your answer stand.
Right. In order to find the origin of Proto-Indo-European languages, in your book, you have try to reconstruct the word for like will or for horse, equus, aswa, aspa. So you have tried to reconstruct using the same methodology. So have you found something in due course? Try to reconstructing and finding the original word that relates to the certain hypothesis.
Let me try and sort of attempt an answer of that. First of all, we didn't actually reconstruct those words. We used other people's reconstructions. There's a great deal of scholarship, and we cherish it. But what we sort of examined the evidence for the fact that these words can be reconstructed to the Proto-Indo-European language. But then what's the conclusion from that? The conclusion is that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European probably had very active interaction with horses, close familiarity with horses, and they already had wheels. And then we ask a question of the archaeological scholarship, like we turn to archaeologists and say, guys, where do you find evidence in the archaeological record for wheels and for close interaction with horses? Probably domestication of horses. And it turns out to overlap with the Steppe hypothesis as far as Indo-European languages are concerned. Anatolian hypothesis takes us too far back in the past and to a place where there were no domesticated horses. There were donkeys, but not horses. For Proto-Indo-European language, we can't reconstruct the word for donkey. So we know we're in the wrong place and in the wrong time.
Right, and the wheel is very important. And there's the archaeological evidence is that wheels didn't appear until early in the Bronze Age, or just a little before the Bronze Age, where the Anatolian hypothesis goes back to the Neolithic, much earlier, and there's no evidence whatsoever of horses being domesticated anywhere, of wheels being used anywhere. And it's not just the wheel too. There are reconstructions for axle and what is it called, the thill,
the thill, what you use to connect the horse to the vehicle, whatever you have.
We're not sure when people were actually riding on the backs of horses. There's evidence about bit wear from the teeth, and this is something archaeologists have worked on a lot. So these Proto-Indo-Europeans, probably weren't riding on horses, but they were using them for transport, which on this open grassland environment is such a huge advantage. Here's an interesting thing in looking at North America. Horses actually evolved in North America and then went extinct about 12,000 years ago. And then they were introduced by the Spaniards. And when the American Indians acquired horses, late 1600s was really when it happened, they developed a horse riding way of life very rapidly, and it totally transformed their culture. It made them vastly more powerful. And we have good evidence that the languages of some of these horse riding Indians started to spread. The Comanches were a very powerful group of Indians who lived in the southern plains. They dominated the southern plains really until the 1870s. They raided all the way into central Mexico. And in Spanish-speaking villages in New Mexico, there's good evidence that people were learning Comanche because the Comanches were so powerful and also very important traders and merchants. So they were militarily powerful, they were economically powerful, they were highly mobile, and their language is spreading. And this was only possible because they had horses. So, horses are just a huge advantage. And it's really no surprise that people who have horses are going to have these advantages and spread their language in areas where people didn't have this.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to chirp in and just kind of mention that just from reading later, like medieval European history, there are a lot of accounts that describe armies, and they say, well, when you have uh, uh, people on horseback versus an army that doesn't have horses, it's kind of like the horse in the Middle Ages was sort of the modern equivalent of a tank. It just carried the enemy as much as it allowed to destroy them physically. So it was a very important technology. It's unimaginable to think that people in Anatolia would say, yeah, we're familiar, but we don't need the horse and the wheel. Like,
Or let's just take an example from India, the Bhagavad Gita, right? Isn't that all about, was it Arjuna, the charioteer? If I'm trying to remember this right, the incredible importance of the charioteer, because the chariots were the tanks of the time. They were the killer weapon. And so it's just so central to deep history.
Adding to that, the horses, finding the archaeological proof of horses. So in India, there is a rock shelter, Bhimbetka rock shelter, that dates back to 8000 BCE. So it has rock paintings, something like of horses. People claim that it's horses, and like there is a debate in historian that is it horse or not. But yeah, people are riding something like horses, and they are aiming something. So yeah, so it looks like horses, and that dates back to 8000 BC. If we compare that origins of languages relate to horses, so there might be further debate. Is it just Sanskrit or Proto-Indo-European, or more proto to that?
I'm not familiar with those drawings. I'd like to read about them. One thing that I would say is this is not a settled issue. New evidence continues to come up. As new evidence comes up, I think we have to be open-minded, and we have to assess that evidence, and we have to be willing to change our mind. Sometimes new evidence can really change the way we look at things. So, in many of these issues, our conclusions are provisional, and we're open to new findings. If that's what you say is true, that would really change the prehistorical picture. So,
yeah. I think it's a very important thing about our book. It's not so much about like which conclusion is the right conclusion. It's more about which methods are the right methods and which approaches are better approaches, and what are some of the methodological mistakes that some people make or shouldn't make, and so on. So it's more about like assessment, verification, rather than just like this is the foregone conclusion, this is what you're supposed to believe. And I think in that respect, it's sort of maybe even more scientific. Gray and Atkinson, they like to point out, oh, we do things with math and computers and so probabilities. It's more scientific than the old fuddy-duddy historical linguistics people who did things, pen and pencil kind of stuff. But I think one of the main claims of our book, or just sort of spread over the entire book of ours, is that it's not so much about whether you do numbers and crunch them on computers that makes your work scientific. It's about verification. It's about the logic in whether the conclusion follows from the premise. That is, and verification. That is what makes something scientific or fails that scientific test.
So before we conclude, I would like to know about both of you, your future work and current work that you are doing.
well, I've just retired from Stanford University. I've been working for a long time on geopolitical issues, particularly mapping of geopolitics. It's a long way from the Indo-European controversy. I'm really not sure what I'm going to be doing with it. I've also been doing some environmental writings. And to be quite honest, I've been spending a lot of time with my grandchildren and doing non-academic things as well. But I'm going to continue to be active in scholarship, but I have always liked to jump around from one topic to another. It probably hasn't helped my academic career. I trained originally as a Southeast Asianist. My first work was in the Philippines, but I'm really drawn to sort of world historical and geographical issues. This is what I'm curious about. I want to learn about as many places as I can. That's not what most scholars do. We're supposed to specialize in a given place or time for historians. And I understand that. I value it, but I'm just a little more too restless, I suppose, for that.
I just wanted to mention that this work that Martin mentioned that we're doing now, there's actually a very big language component to that too. Talk about how languages have been used, are being used, maybe shouldn't be used to define ethnicities, to define nations, to define states, and so on. And I think it's a very important piece of scholarship that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I really enjoyed reading drafts of your recent work. Me, I also sort of left academia, and I've been doing some other work. And I'm now working on the 4th edition of my book called Languages of the World, also from Cambridge University Press. So this has been occupying a lot of my time lately. And I'm also working on like the first drafts of another book, which is going to be more of a popular book about the importance of grammar. And it's something we mentioned in our conversation earlier today, that you can't just look at words and think language is just a collection of words. There's actually structural elements that all the words sort of like hang on to. And I'm trying to write a popular book to kind of educate people outside of academia about that. So,
and I would highly recommend Asya's book, Languages of the World, as she said, now in the 4th edition. So it is really global coverage, all major language families, lots of very interesting information, and also it's designed for students, and so there are actually problem sets that you can work through to try to understand how linguistics works with real examples. And if I understand right, you're going to have more maps in the 4th edition. Is that right?
Oh, yes, we're going to have more maps. There's a whole chapter on languages of South Asia, sort of from Iran to India, kind of that part of the world. There's a separate chapter. And yeah, and it's primarily for students, undergraduate students, sort of young students, whether students in linguistics or students who might not end up being students of linguistics. But it's also a book that I'm trying to write as much of to be accessible to just a regular educated adult, not necessarily a student of linguistics. Thank you.
Right, anyone could pick it up and get a lot out of it.
Yeah, thank you, professors. Thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and best wishes.
Thank you. Me too. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.